our final speaker is here. This is Dr. Rose Stewart. I won't tell you too much about her because she's going to tell you all about herself. But we are going to ask her a couple of silly questions, as we have done with all the other speakers. Rose is a clinical psychologist, and I want to ask her, does she ruin psychological films for people like we do, medical dramas, like Casualty, and, you know, we ruin that, nurses?
Yeah, I am a bit of a nightmare to watch psychological thrillers with, because I constantly sit there going, that doesn't make any sense, that's completely inaccurate, and then try and educate people on why it's all wrong. And I'm not good to take to the cinema, I'm really sorry. The one film that is accurate, the one film that is really accurate and people should watch is Inside Out, the Disney Pixar film.
Oh yeah, I love that.
Actually, it's actually a really good explanation of how memory works, how trauma works, and how children's brains develop. So that's the one film that I would definitely recommend.
Top tip. Cool. The other really funny quick question that we have is, and it's related a little bit to your talk, what is your favourite Spice Girls song? I don't know if anyone has seen the reference to your talk. We're having a little conversation. Amanda doesn't even know what songs they sang, so
I would, there are so many good ones. I think I'd have to go classic and go Wannabe, because it was such a big moment in history and started the whole thing off. So I'm going to go with the classic one.
Cool. Okie dokie. Well, we'll let you get on with your thing. I know everyone's probably super excited to hear your talk, as they always are. So
okay, so this is the moment of truth where I try and share my screen with you, and we hope that my internet doesn't fail. Okay, right, I'm hoping everybody can see that. So this is my talk, which I'm calling Psych Up Your Life. Apologies in advance if anybody was expecting the Spice Girls to feature. As Partha said, this is all voluntary, so we didn't have the budget for it. But I'm hoping that Amanda and Beth might be able to put something together during the lunch break for you. Okay, so my job, I am a clinical psychologist, and I've been working for some time in diabetes services, so I'm what's called a diabetes psychologist. And I work in a young adult service, and that is incredibly rare across the UK. So paediatric diabetes psychologists are pretty common, because there's a lot of legislation. There's things like the best practice tariff, which ensures that there are more psychology posts in paediatric services. But in adult services and in young adult services where I work, we are a lot more rare. So I work as an integrated psychologist. So that means that as well as doing therapy sessions with people, I sit in on the young adult clinics, and I get to know all of the young adults within our service. And that helps a lot in terms of being able to get to know people maybe before things become a really big problem. And I work with people with a really wide range of difficulties. So that could be things like burnout or needle phobia. It could be things like trauma. It could be where people are in a really risky place with lots of DKA admissions or eating disorders. And then I do a bit more of the sort of complex side of things as well. So if somebody needs a neuropsychological assessment or something like that doing, then I would be in a position to do that. I also do a lot of research and training. So some of you might have had the experience of meeting the lovely Sophie, who did the Kindness in Diabetes tweetorial for us a few months ago on the 101 account. And so Sophie is a trainee psychologist who's been on placement with me. So that's half of my job. And the other half of my job is working in an all Wales role and writing self-help guides. So we write the Talking Type 1 range. And at the moment, a big part of my job in the all Wales side of things is looking at COVID recovery planning and how we can sort of integrate the psychological side of things into the support that we're giving to people. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about psychological vulnerabilities in people with diabetes, and why there's all this stuff about people with diabetes maybe finding things a bit harder and issues with depression or anxiety being a little bit more prevalent, and why that happens. I'm also going to talk to you a lot more about life in a COVID and kind of where we are now, this sort of post-COVID world, but it's still going on. And I'm going to hopefully give you some strategies that are going to be useful for you sort of here and now, because we know life has gotten incredibly stressful for a lot of us. So some things that might be useful for you. Okay, so why are people who live with diabetes maybe a bit more vulnerable to developing psychological issues? Well, a big part of it is the burden of living with diabetes, because we know living with diabetes is really, really hard a lot of the time. So having any kind of long-term condition does just make life more stressful. There's more that you've got to think about. There's more that you've got to worry about. You've regularly got to deal with things like hospital parking or managing your prescriptions. It's just an added stress onto your life. And then we know that diabetes, on top of that, is a really difficult condition to manage, especially type 1, or if you're on insulin, you've got to do things like your regular blood glucose monitoring. You might have to be carb counting. There's issues like hypos. And we know that diabetes is a really unstable condition, that a lot of people work really, really hard and don't get a lot of the time predictable results. So it can often feel like you're failing. And then on top of that, we've got the sort of system around the person, that sometimes we get on really well with our diabetes teams, and sometimes that is much harder. On top of the burden of living with diabetes, we've also got baggage, and that's the stuff that we all bring into living with diabetes. So these are the experiences that we have all been through that might make us more vulnerable for those stresses activating these issues. So there's something called adverse childhood events. And so these are difficult experiences that we might have been through as children. And we know that if people have been through lots of these experiences, that then increases their vulnerability later in life. We've got things like attachment and parenting styles. So some of us had really great supportive parents and things went well for us in childhood. Other times, not so much. And again, if you've had that sort of experience, that doesn't definitely mean to say that you are going to experience psychological issues for the rest of your life, but it just increases that vulnerability. Having a neurodevelopmental issue, so maybe something like autism or ADHD, or having a learning disability, all of these things can make living with diabetes more complicated. And we know that there's lots of evidence that things like deprivation and poverty makes worse outcomes. If you've had trauma going on in your life, and for a lot of people, if you've had a traumatic experience with diagnosis, so if your diagnosis involved a really scary DKA admission, for example, that can have an impact on how your relationship with diabetes is formed, sort of going on. And then, of course, we've got our life stage. So there's a reason why I've got a young adult post, because we know that in late adolescence and into sort of early 20s, that actually that's the time when distress often peaks for people. So just the age that you're at can make you more vulnerable. But that doesn't mean to say that every single person living with diabetes is going to develop sort of big psychological issues. It just increases that vulnerability. Okay. So COVID, I think the most important message to get out there is that our worlds, all of our worlds, have been completely turned upside down by this. Life has changed so much, and it is completely normal if you don't feel okay about that. I cannot stress that enough. I know there's loads in the media about a sort of mental health epidemic, and everybody's going to have all these new diagnoses and things like that. But actually, one of the unifying things about COVID is that everybody has found it incredibly stressful. And so that's something that we all need to help ourselves with. So during COVID, and this, when I say during COVID, I'm sort of thinking about that March, April time when lockdown was happening and things were still really, really scary. So there was that big fear at the beginning, this, what is this thing? Where is it coming from? And what does it mean for me? Am I at risk? Is me being type 1 diabetic or having type 2 diabetes, is that going to make a big difference to how COVID's going to affect me? And then we've all had this thing of, did I catch it? Did I sort of, was that thing I had back in November COVID? It's all really sort of scary and uncertain. And then we've had serious isolation going on. So lockdown happened, and for a lot of us that would have meant sort of isolating with our families, and for some of us that would have been isolating completely alone, or families might have been split apart by that as well, and that has a big impact on people. And particularly for adolescents and young people who we know are really, really dependent on their friendships and their support groups, not being able to access that, even though we've got things like the internet and social media, that has a really profound effect on people. So many people will have been shielding as well, so sort of going that level above, and so not having access to anybody and the people that we really care about, so children or grandchildren or partners, that has again a big impact. Working from home has become a big part of life for many of us. A lot of people are saying this thing that it's not working from home, it's living at work. And that's often very true, that we're sitting at desks and maybe doing hours much, much more than we would be if we were going to an office. And then there's been a big change. So lots of us have been sort of working around the clock, and that's led to a big increase in inactivity. Also all the Netflix binging. There's been a lot of sort of sitting on the sofa, and we know that that doesn't help in terms of our health. Routine's gone completely out of the window, and school and work has been massively affected. So many schools have gone to online learning. A lot of us will have had to have started homeschooling, which is enough to push anybody way over the edge. And it's all a massive change for people. And a lot of the things that we were expecting in terms of milestones for school or university or apprenticeships, all of that's suddenly gone. And so the plan has gone out of the window. And relationships have changed in a big, big way. So you might have gotten on really well with your partner before lockdown. It's very, very different when you have to spend 24 hours together in each other's company. And similarly, a lot of relationships that were newer, for example, people might have moved in together a bit more quickly than they were planning to, or they might have been very distanced from their partner because they haven't been able to isolate together. So big, big change. And this constant uncertainty of when will this end? And if we've had appointments disrupted, sort of where is my team? What's going on? When is this going to sort of restart again? And the unifying thing of banana bread, and how many carbs is in this when we're all baking? It's really complicated stuff. And so the place that we're sort of coming to now, I know I've said it's post-COVID, and clearly COVID is still going on, but it kind of feels like we're in this new place at the moment where things are starting to get back to normal, but there's still a lot of this fear and uncertainty. So a lot of people are grappling with the decisions about going back to school or going back to work at the moment and trying to work out if that's safe. And also where work or school has been disrupted. There's a big concern about how will I catch up with this stuff and how will things change. So a lot of our expectations have completely been blown out of the water. And for a lot of us, sort of working from home or virtually working might be something that's going to stay long term. And so there's a lot of sort of considering how that's going to affect us. The health effects, we know that lockdown for a lot of people has not been great for health. So a lot of us may have put on weight, or we may have sort of gone into a more sedentary lifestyle. For a lot of people that I've been working with, actually lockdown's been amazing for their diabetes management because they've had nothing else to focus on. But there's this sort of fear that when life gets more back to normal, that this improvement in diabetes management won't be sustained. So it's thinking about that. we're still very much in the research wondering about the long-term effects of COVID, and we just don't know at the moment. There's so much more research that needs to happen. And thinking about when will appointments restart, it's a big cause of anxiety for a lot of people. And then we've got these long-term effects on sort of economic issues. So people have been laid off, businesses have shut down. We don't know how long that's going to last for. And there can be some really significant psychological effects. So people could have been really ill with COVID, and that can have traumatic effects. Or you might have been bereaved, and that grief is something that is very, very different in lockdown, when you maybe can't access a lot of the support from friends and family that you would normally be relying on. And we know that politically that there may be some long-term effects with this. We know that the relationship that we have with governments and with scientific bodies is kind of different now, where it's less trusting maybe than it previously was. And so there could be some big ramifications long term. And still we've got this uncertainty of, when will this end? Will it ever end? Will life ever be the same again? Wondering sort of what's safe for me to do. And this whole thing of, who do I trust? The information that we're constantly being bombarded with is often very different depending on what sources you look at, and even from the same sources sort of contradicts itself day on day. So we're in this sort of really scary and confusing place at the moment. So these are some ideas for strategies that might help you to manage some of those uncertainties and some of those anxieties that are going on. And like any good psychologist, I have come up with an acronym. If you've been to see a psychologist and you haven't come out with either an acronym or a diagram, you need to go back and get your money's worth. Okay, so this is think, which is take a moment, try and hold on to what's important. Think about the information you're receiving, not all at once, and kindness. So I cannot stress this first point enough. A lot of us during lockdown have had the opportunity to take some more time to do things that are good for our minds, whether that's taking up exercise or gardening or doing jigsaws or rediscovering a childhood hobby. That kind of thing is really, really important. And I urge you, if you have managed to find the time for something like this during lockdown, please try and hold on to it. This time spent relaxing and enjoying stuff is absolutely essential. It undoes the difficult effects of stress. It undoes some of those stress hormones, and it's really good for your entire body and your entire mind. So trying to build in time within your routine to do those things is absolutely important. So I made the point earlier about this whole living at work situation, and I know it's a really, really difficult balance to strike, that trying to do things like switching off your emails at weekends or in evenings, or just making a bit of a deal with yourself that you're not going to answer emails after 6 p.m. or whenever it is, and making sure you take your breaks is really, really important. I can't stress enough that if you've got something that works for you, some sort of relaxation strategy or some kind of self-care, you need to do it particularly when things are stressful. I see this all the time, that when people get stressed and they get busy, the first thing to go out the window is self-care. And that is the time when you need it most. So really trying to remind yourself that actually self-care activities, relaxation activities are really important, especially when life is stressful, is absolutely key. Also, if you have managed to save some time during lockdown, if you're now sort of working from home and you don't have to commute, or if you are sort of managing to do things more efficiently with virtual meetings, for example, that time is a gift, my friends. So rather than using that time to just pile on more and more emails, I'd really, really encourage you to try and use that time wisely. So whether it's doing something like cooking yourself a proper meal or taking the time to do 10 minutes of exercise, try and use that new time that you've got in a way that is going to be genuinely beneficial and not just for doing more work. Holding on to what's important. There's two key questions here that I would like you to think about. And the first one is, what or who have you missed most during lockdown? And what were the things that kept you going during lockdown? Because these are really, really important. I can almost guarantee you that nobody will have been saying, it was my work emails that I really, really missed. It's people, and it's often experiences. So for me, I really want to go and hug my mum really, really badly. And I really, really want to go to the seaside. And it's those kind of important things that we might forget often when things get a bit more back to normal. So it's really important to try and connect with those things that are so essential for you, and then building them into your life as you go forwards. This is something called your values. And if you can identify your values, those things that are most important to you as a person, that is absolutely key. If you can make your decisions based around those things, that is absolutely key for long-term feeling like you're living a life that is rewarding and meaningful to you. Our next point is information, because we know it is an infodemic out there. It's been absolutely swamped with information. We know that good information can help you make decisions and can really help your diabetes management. Having that education is absolutely key. But sometimes we can get the impression that the more information we have, that we can control everything. And we know that that is not the case. So I would really encourage you to try and keep control of the information that's coming into you. Don't feel like you have to be constantly switched on to your phone, unless it's this conference, obviously. And it's okay sometimes to want to switch off if you're feeling overwhelmed. Not all at once. This is an absolutely key thing that I work on with people with diabetes, is this idea of just one thing. Because so often people feel like they have to be perfect, like they have to manage everything perfectly. And that often leads people into a place of burnout where they can't do anything at all. I can assure you that trying to manage this thing perfectly will often lead you to misery. So trying to break down your challenges into little steps, little goals, and trying to think about, okay, maybe I can't do that whole thing today. If I'm not feeling great, I am not going to get that amazing Libre graph that I am trying to get all the time. But thinking about just one thing. What is one step that you can do? What is one move that you can make in the right direction? And recognize the progress that you're making. You might not be where you want to be, but if you are moving in the right direction, that is absolutely key. So take the time to recognize your own progress and celebrate that when it happens. And finally, kindness. Kindness is absolutely key, particularly for people with diabetes, because it's so easy to get into beating yourself up and feeling like you're failing and feeling like you're not doing things well enough. So the things that I would often get people thinking about is, what would you say to a friend who is trying to manage their diabetes as best they can? The chances are that you would not be anywhere near as critical or berating as you are to yourself sometimes. So try and talk to yourself with kindness. And I'd really encourage you to try and engage in acts of kindness. So if you get the opportunity, do something like volunteering to help somebody. If you have the option to, maybe think about donating to a food bank, something like that, or doing random acts of kindness, because there's so much evidence that this stuff actually makes you feel so much better about yourself. So if you want to feel better about yourself, help other people. It's really key. And then maybe thinking about as well having an emergency repair kit around. So when you know that you might have some bad days, having something around that you can go to that's going to look after you in that place. So whether it's sort of pictures of people or places that give you a good feeling or a good song, have that in place in advance. So because bad days do come, they come for all of us, but having something there that's going to make you feel better is really, really important. Okay, I'm going to leave you with this quote from the Moomins, which is, "All things are so very uncertain, and that's exactly what makes me feel reassured, because one thing we can always rely on is that the world is not reliable."
Oh, I love the Moomins.
So do I.
Have you been to the Moomin shop in Covent Garden?
I have. I spent a really enormous amount of money there and regret it.
Oh, thank you so much. That was so good. We have tons and tons of questions for you, as expected. Like I said, we will take all questions and get all the answers from Rose. And if we don't get to all of them, we will get them out to you, we promise. But the one question, well, we've got, I think, 3 we picked out to ask you. I'm trying to find it in my... Okay, so Rose, regarding the burden and the impact on mental health, do you think that increased use of technology in diabetes, so things like the Libre, CGM, that kind of stuff, do you think it has a positive or negative impact on people's mental health? Because some people, has it got the potential to reduce the burden, or can it make things worse with having, say, more anxiety of looking at numbers all the time and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think for the vast majority of people, having access to things like Libre or CGM has been massively beneficial. I've seen loads of people who have turned things around on the back of having this technology. But I think as well, we need to be careful, because particularly if you're someone who gets quite anxious or maybe is a bit perfectionisty, having things like a graph that's constantly telling you how well you're doing or how spiky things are can be really, really difficult. So for the vast majority of people, it's brilliant and great, but for some people it can cause more stress.
Yeah, I think as a DSN, I'm always quite sure to show people graphs of people that don't have diabetes, and actually their graphs are up and down all the time as well. And so, you know, none of us expect it to be perfectly flat lines. And I think, you know, a lot of people in the community say flat lines are for dead people, that kind of stuff. But, it does help. Yeah,
definitely. Okay, there's a question about diabetes burnout. What are the signs of diabetes burnout? Is there a way to spot it early? What should we do about them? What's the first step?
Okay, so diabetes burnout always starts with diabetes distress. And this is this sort of phrase that encompasses basically how much you hate your diabetes on a day-to-day level. And sometimes it feels like it's just a sort of slightly annoying thing that's in the background. Sometimes it feels like it's this massive monster that's kind of waiting to come and get you. And so I think that would be one of the key things, is working on that diabetes distress, that if you can actually make space for your diabetes and not get caught up in this thing of really hating it, because I can assure you, I've known lots and lots of people who've worked really, really hard on hating their diabetes, never once made it go away. So it's really thinking about, okay, well, is hating my diabetes actually helping me? Is it making my diabetes disappear? No. Is it helping me get on with my life? Also no. So it's really important to try and work on that acceptance side of things. In terms of the burnout, I really often see people being particularly vulnerable for this when they try and get into this thing of, I need perfect diabetes, because that almost always backfires, and then people get really disheartened and feel like they've failed, and then they sort of feel like they want to give up, and that's often where burnout comes from. So the big things would be to try and just manage things one step at a time and try and make things realistic for you. You might not be able to get 100% all of the time. And so trying to manage it with kindness and talking to yourself with kindness is absolutely key.
So meditation, let's go with that one. Do you think that helps?
Okay, so one of the things with meditation and breathing work is that it's trying to get into this thing called mindfulness. And mindfulness is one way of getting to a point where you recognize that your thoughts are just thoughts and you don't have to constantly do what your head says. Kind of hoping that makes sense. So quite often my head will tell me really unhelpful things like, I don't know, your son came into your Zoom call and made you look really unprofessional and everyone's going to think you're a loser.
No, everyone loves
it. Loving it, absolutely loving it that you're a mum.
And if I got really stuck into that thought that made me look unprofessional and I'm a loser, I could sort of take steps based on that. So I could like delete my Twitter account. I could go into this thing of, oh God, I'm a complete failure, and get really dragged down by that. Or when I recognize that thought comes up, because we all have these weird and scary thoughts that come up. If you've seen Inside Out and those little characters in your head, so things like the fear character will come up and say, it was terrible, it was really bad, everyone's really scared. And then the anger voice will come and say something completely different. But if you can just observe those thoughts and recognize, oh, okay, there's that weird thought going on, and not get dragged into it, that is really, really key for not being sort of held captive by these scary thoughts that crop up. And they crop up for everybody. I cannot stress that enough. You, me, Partha, everyone gets them, I promise you. So it's really important to, if you can, get into a place where you're not dragged around by your thoughts. And that's what mindfulness is about. So meditating and breathing is about giving you the space. It's kind of like yoga for your brain, so that you can sort of decide which thoughts that you want to get involved with and which ones you can step away from.
Okay, so we've got one more. The chat did descend into talk of alcohol. So I've got this one from Paul Niven, and it says, what does your choice of alcohol say about your personality?
Oh, now.
I'm not sure we've got an answer to that one, but I just thought I'd add it in because, you know.
We said we'd love that the chat had descended into what's everyone's favourite alcohol, because Rose loves a cocktail, don't you?
I do. Well, yeah, my husband's sort of lockdown thing, rather than baking, he's gotten into cocktail making. And I've been forced, because I'm a supportive partner, to help sample those. Yeah, it's been really tough. So yeah, other than if you drink absinthe, there's something very wrong with you. That's pretty much, as far as I'd go.